On May 29, 1913, a new ballet opens with a strange bassoon playing in its highest capacity and ends in a full-blown riot. The Ballet Rouge Company performed for the very first time in France Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, a performance that would go down to be one of the most famous scandals in the history of the arts, and an orchestral work that would be considered arguably the most influential piece of the 20th century. By the beginning of the piece on opening night, there reportedly were already some disturbances in the audience which only rose when the curtains opened for the second movement, with dancers stopping aggressively to a complicated rhythm of the loud and intimidating music. People began shouting, arguing, and some accounts claimed there were projectiles thrown and fighting in the audience. So why did it cause so much controversy? Stravinsky was an up-and-coming musical prodigy. His overnight success with his first ballet, Firebird, in 1910 won him critical acclaim around the world and set him off on his way for a very successful career. So it came as a surprise to everyone when he created The Rite of Spring, a work that was so experimental and different that people considered him a madman. The storyline follows various primitive rituals celebrating the advent of spring, after which a young girl is chosen as a sacrificial victim and dances herself to death. For its time, nothing like this had ever been seen, especially in 1913. It was a completely new and completely unique performance that was not at all like any Western classical music, and so this was not really something that had been seen before at all, especially the ballet performance, which caused him to be in the newspapers, and Nijinsky as well, who actually choreographed the performance. But that didn't mean that it didn't go appreciated. It opened up a new way for many composers to start experimenting with their music, and not only this, but it did get some critical acclaim as well. The Rite of Spring was actually used as a piece in Fantasia, the one with the dinosaurs in it, if anybody's seen that. And it has also had an incredible influence on movie soundtracks from horror to sci-fi, and John Williams has taken a lot of artistic inspiration from The Rite of Spring. In fact, there's an example where he actually took a part from Part 2 introduction, almost note for note, in Dune Sea of Tatooine. A couple years later, in 1914, Mars the Bringer of War by Gustav Holst came out, and that also takes very clear inspiration from The Rite of Spring. At the time, the threat of World War I was very high, and Mars depicts this fear, the sound of troops and weapons. And if it sounds like Star Wars, it should. John Williams also took immense inspiration from Mars and the rest of the music on The Planets by Gustav Holst, giving Star Wars its very legendary sound. So it's fascinating to think just how modern Holst and Stravinsky were for their time, and how incredible their impact was on film. Of course, these are only a few examples, but this is where we start to see a sharp change in the way we looked at music, and music started changing a lot, and we saw music kind of split off into all these different genres, and it's really interesting to see how far we've come in just 100 years. I don't think anybody can comprehend just how much the Industrial Revolution has changed everything, and it changed the way we could make music, the way we could use noise, the type of music we could create, and it's really amazing. So here I'm going to be interviewing my dad, and the reason I wanted to interview him is because he is a bass professor at BYU, and he is just extremely smart and knows everything about music and more, and doesn't give himself enough credit for how widely renowned he is in the music community. And so I just wanted to ask him kind of about all of this. What would you consider to be one of the biggest contributing factors to music changing so quickly and into so many different genres in just 100 years?
I think it's the rise of humanism.
Hmm.
Um, for centuries, humanity was kind of governed by this idea of of a higher, that we are humans are trying to appeal, and the humans are secondary to this idea of a heaven or God or
Yeah.
something higher than humanity. But with the rise of humanism and that the man and our world and man's achievement is the measure of things, and that people kind of survived and lived and contributed on their own merits, even the growth of atheism in the arts, and that rather than looking to something more noble and appealing to that which we call the noble characteristics like kindness and love and beauty and stuff like that, it was more either a recognition of or a completely delving into the more sordid and sometimes very sad and tragic sides to humanity and things that people do to each other, going from kind of a classical or Baroque uh, sentiment where the focus of things was storytelling based on a focus on kind of the good things and success and redemptive stories and things that turned out well, and the idea of dissonance or struggle or things that were hard for people were kind of the spice that came along in small degrees during a rather kind of a more positive story. And this was reflected sometimes in the key, the
Yeah.
use of dissonance. Things are predominantly in the major. Things are very consonant and resonant, and it's a focus more on describing beauty or a perception and an idea of beauty, and that was the focus. And then with the growth of romanticism and humanism, almost where the values were reversed. Instead of things being primarily consonant and sunny and happy and warm with accents of dissonance here and there, that was almost flipped, where the emphasis was darkness and dissonance and things, and then perhaps right at the end or by the end, there was kind of a transformer or a catharsis, and things came through. The whole rise of the technological revolution, the industrial revolution, and the idea that suddenly man could conquer and temper the elements. They could conquer and control illness with the rise, all the medical advances in the last,
Yeah.
from the 1700s until the mid 20th century. Man is the measure of things, and so people begin to express and view the sentiments of what the artist felt, sometimes without any. There's not a moral compass, because the morals of one person is not shared by the morals of the other person. So they would share and say and do and write about and portray things that perhaps others would feel like, oh, those, we shouldn't deal or talk about those things. And so it created this wider palette, and the world knows about the history of Russia and Stalin and the oppression and those kinds of regimes, and composers like Prokofiev and Shostakovich, who were censored and dealt with very difficult, not only artistic conditions, but personal, and watched family and friends and societies deal with. And Shostakovich particularly was very moved by communist regime, by fascisms, by despots and leadership that just had this crippling grip on everything about humanity. And artistic freedom was not freedom at all. Artistic expression was governed and censured and told yes or no, you can do it or that. And so in his music, he portrays some very hard and difficult moments. I was having a lesson, one of my teachers, and he said they were doing a lot of Shostakovich. He said, I was kind of optimistic. He goes, oh, do you love it? He said, no, I'm so tired of doing Shostakovich. It's depressing. I feel like going home and kicking my dog. So the world wars were certainly just devastating
Yeah.
to everything that was going on, because with the rise of technology, medicine, and science, things were in some ways getting so much better. But then it also increased the technology to turn technology into weapons that were bigger and badder, and there's no emotional or visceral connection kind of to what they're doing, and you can be very distant. And so I'm sure that has contributed in many ways to this kind of disconnect. And I might add, really, that what we're using right now, the phone, and the use of a screen, and I would say that our society, in some ways, we're more removed from each other in terms of moment to moment, personal, face to face talking and contact. Things are
Yeah.
done by text. But the irony is that in some ways we're more connected because of all these social platforms where anybody can post any little moment and you can see and peer into people's lives, whether
Yeah.
it's a real moment, whether it's a staged moment, whether it's a distorted moment with effects or whatever. But in some ways, we're further apart because we don't really interact I feel, on a real good communicative human level. Yet you're aware of the personal life of Jay-Z or something like that, and we know all this stuff about so many people that we would have never interacted with. So it's this weird situation, and I think that definitely affects art.
How do you think we saw culture and music begin to be more shared and more widespread throughout the world?
I think the two biggest things have been the Industrial Revolution and the advent of the railroad and the airplane and travel. More than any time in the period of world history, people could get in and have direct contact with another country. And that's just been ramped up now with this technology where in a second, you can access any culture in any world. You can see music and art and interviews and people, and kind of like on a screen, you can kind of experience it and see it. And so one of the effects of the internet and how it's made the world is it changes cultures as well. In some ways, it dilutes the sense of, for example, English.
Yeah.
English is now the number one language in the world because of the internet. In some ways, that's kind of a tragedy because it dilutes and pollutes an otherwise pure language. But again, we have to recognize that that's a natural consequence of cultures coming together.
Yeah.
And learning more about each other. So it's a two-edged sword. It's that's a much bigger discussion.
What pieces of music from the 20th century would you consider to be some of the most influential pieces?
I would cite two of them as being, of course, The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, just because it was a performance piece which has no sound to it from the performer. And so it pushed the boundaries of the discussion of what is music. I would also say I can't think of any pieces by name because I'm not familiar with his work that well. But there was a German composer, Karl Stockhausen. He was one of the foremost figures in the avant-garde period of music. And for example, he did a piece I remembered as being a sonata. And one of the movements was there's a little pile of sticks in the middle of the stage. A performer walks out, sits at the sticks and breaks them into smaller chunks, and then gets up and walks off. And that's one movement. Another movement was a little hut with a pile of shingles and some small nails. The performer comes out and with a hammer puts shingles on the little roof of the hut. And that's another movement.
Do you think it is harder to make controversial music nowadays than it was back then? Or is it just a difference in what controversy meant?
Yeah, to make controversial music now, I don't know how you do it. It seems like in everything controversial has been tried to be portrayed and done on stage and in live performance. I would say it probably is more about innovations and different ways of portraying those things. I mean, everything from all the shocking stuff, murder, abuse, war, all of those things have been portrayed and written and talked about and exemplified. And so it would be innovative, new ways, maybe new sounds, new things, the electronics available. There's just millions of different sounds that you can make now just through electronics. So, but to make controversial things really has to focus more around, I guess, the same thing in the past where you would take things and portray them like LGBTQ issues or, art about Black Lives Matter on either side of that spectrum, or people who are very controversial like Trump or Kanye West or Putin, that would be a controversial piece of art just because of the subject matter, maybe more for the subject matter than the music or the sounds. So that would depend. Yeah.